Professor Velneth had taught advanced quantum mechanics at the Galactic Institute for 214 cycles. In that time, he had instructed over 40,000 students from 372 different species. He had seen students who breathed methane, students who existed partially in alternate dimensions, students who were technically hive minds piloting meat puppets, and one memorable student who was essentially a sentient cloud of angry bees with a philosophy degree. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Not once, not ever, in all those cycles, had he seen a student bring a predator to class. Until today. The human, whose name was apparently Kira Chen, and who had enrolled in his class approximately 6 solar rotations ago, sat in the third row with what could only be described as a small apex predator curled up on her desk. The creature, which Professor Velneth's cerebral implant unhelpfully identified as a juvenile Felis catus, domestic subspecies, was purring loud enough to interfere with the acoustic sensors in the lecture hall. Professor Velneth's 3 eye stalks swiveled to focus on the situation. Around the lecture hall, which seated approximately 200 students, there was a notable gap radiating outward from Kira Chen's position. The nearest occupied seat was a full 4 rows away, where a crystalline student had wedged itself into a corner and appeared to be praying to several deities simultaneously. "Miss Chen," Professor Velneth said, his voice translator adding what he hoped was an appropriate level of stern authority. "There appears to be a predatory carnivore on your desk." Kira Chen looked up from her datapad. She had been taking notes, apparently completely unbothered by the fact that she had brought an honest-to-entropy predator into an institution of higher learning. "Oh yeah, that's Captain Fluffybottom. He's cool." Captain Fluffybottom, who was objectively not cool by any definition involving temperature or social acceptability, opened one eye and made a sound that Professor Velneth's translator interpreted as territorial challenge vocalization. "That is," Professor Velneth began, choosing his words carefully because human responses to stress were legendary, and he did not want to be the subject of the next Florida man fights entire dorm building. Incident report, not permitted per University Regulations 17-42 through 17-49, which specifically prohibit predatory species from communal learning spaces without appropriate containment and safety protocols. "He's in a safety protocol," Kira said, gesturing at the creature. "He's being cute. That's like the safest protocol there is." This was, Professor Velneth reflected, exactly the kind of logic that had led humans to categorize animals into house pets and slightly larger house pets, and house pets we keep outside but still feed, without any regard for the fact that every single one of these animals could and would kill. Something if given half a chance. A planarian student in the front row, who had been slowly oozing toward the exit for the past 3 minutes, finally made their escape with a sound like a very polite, wet mop. Professor Velneth couldn't blame them. Planarians were prey species down to their gelatinous cellular structure. Their fight-or-flight response was so finely tuned that they could detect predator pheromones from 3 systems away. This planarian had lasted longer than most would have. "Miss Chen, I must insist that you remove the predator from this classroom immediately." Kira Chen's expression shifted. It was a subtle thing, barely noticeable to someone who wasn't familiar with human micro-expressions. But Professor Velneth had made it his business to study human behavioral patterns ever since the first human had enrolled 6 cycles ago and promptly terrified half the student body by smiling at them in what she had insisted was a friendly way. The human's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips compressed, Her shoulders squared. These were all signs that Professor Velneth had learned meant a human was about to become unreasonable, which was saying something because humans existed in a state of perpetual unreasonability at the best of times. "Try it," Kira said softly, "and you'll regret it." The lecture hall, which had been filled with the quiet ambient sounds of 200 terrified students trying to breathe quietly enough not to attract predator attention, went completely silent. Professor Velneth's primary brain processed this statement. His secondary brain, which handled threat assessment, began screaming. His tertiary brain, which managed social interactions, suggested perhaps retirement wasn't such a bad idea after all. "Miss Chen, are you threatening a faculty member?" "No," Kira said, and her voice had taken on a tone that Professor Velneth's translator unhelpfully marked as "Mama bear protecting cubs, approximately 73% likely to result in violence." "I'm warning you. Captain Fluffybottom has separation anxiety. If you try to remove him, he'll get stressed. If he gets stressed, I get stressed. If I get stressed, he gets more stressed because he can sense my stress. It's a whole feedback loop thing. Very psychological, very unavoidable." This was, Professor Velneth knew from his extensive reading on human psychology after the friendly smile incident, technically accurate. Humans and their domesticated predators had co-evolved to be psychologically dependent on each other in ways that most species found deeply disturbing. It was like Stockholm Syndrome, except both parties had it simultaneously, and they called it love. "That is not," Professor Velneth said slowly, "how university regulations work." "Cool," Kira said. "Captain Fluffybottom doesn't know how to read, so he's not really bound by them, is he?" Captain Fluffybottom chose this moment to stand up, arch his back in a stretch that showed off approximately 4 sets of retractable claws, and yawn wide enough to display a truly unnecessary number of teeth. A Xyrillian student in the second row fainted. Their desk mate, a brave Tenthorian who had survived 3 separate wars, caught them while maintaining eye contact with the predator in what they clearly hoped was a display of non-threatening submission. Furthermore, Kira continued, as if she hadn't just been responsible for a medical emergency, "Captain Fluffybottom is an emotional support animal. I have documentation. It's all very official and legal and covered under the Galactic Institute's inclusion and accessibility protocols, which I believe supersede the predator prohibition clauses due to the precedent set in the case of Keithrax versus the Administration Board, Cycle 2847. Professor Velneth's eye stalks drooped. He had forgotten about Keithrax versus the Administration Board. Everyone tried to forget about Keithrax versus the Administration Board. That was the case where a Drixilian student had successfully argued that their symbiotic flesh-eating bacteria colony constituted a medical necessity, and therefore couldn't be prohibited from campus, despite the fact that said bacteria had dissolved 3 chairs, 2 desks, and 1 extremely unfortunate maintenance drone. The fact that a human knew about this case was concerning. The fact that she had correctly identified the legal precedent it established was terrifying. "Your emotional support animal," Professor Velneth said, deciding to try a different approach, "is causing emotional distress to approximately 97% of your fellow students." 94%, Kira corrected, glancing around the room. The Krasnian triplets in the back seemed fine. Professor Velneth's eye stalks swiveled. The Krasnian triplets, who were indeed in the back row, waved cheerfully. Krasnians were one of the few species whose homeworld was more hostile than Earth. They thought humans were adorable. They had once described Earth's apex predators as like puppies, but squishier. 94% then, Professor Velneth conceded. My point stands. Does it, though? Kira leaned back in her chair, and Captain Fluffy-Bottom immediately climbed onto her shoulder, where he perched like the world's furriest and most judgmental parrot. Because I checked the accessibility guidelines. Nowhere does it say that an emotional support animal can be prohibited just because other students are scared of it. That would be discriminatory. This was the problem with humans, Professor Velneth reflected. They were simultaneously the most terrifying and the most legalistic species in the galaxy. They had weaponized bureaucracy in ways that most species used actual weapons. There were human lawyers out there who were banned from 3 systems not because they had committed crimes, but because their presence in a courtroom was considered a war crime under the Geneva Convention, which humans had apparently decided applied everywhere they went, despite the fact that Geneva wasn't even on most star charts. Miss Chen, please be reasonable. I am being reasonable, Kira said. I'm not asking for much. I just want to attend class with my emotional support animal, who is very well behaved and hasn't hurt anyone. As if on cue, Captain Fluffy-Bottom made a sound like a tiny chainsaw and began grooming himself, one leg pointed straight up in the air, in a display that Professor Velneth's translator marked as obscene flexibility, possible threat display. He attacked Professor Yalnix's service drone last week. Professor Velneth pointed out. That drone started it, Kira said immediately. It made a whirring noise. Captain Fluffy-Bottom perceived it as a threat. It was delivering lecture notes. Aggressively. Professor Velneth wondered if it was too late to transfer to the satellite campus on Rigel 7, where the most exciting thing that ever happened was the occasional wormhole anomaly, and those were generally considered a pleasant break from routine. Miss Chen, I am going to contact the administration board. Cool, Kira said, pulling out her datapad. While you do that, I'm going to contact the Student Rights Coalition, the Interspecies Equity Committee, and my mom, who is a lawyer. Not like a space lawyer, a human lawyer, from Earth. From the part of Earth where people solve problems by suing other people so hard that their great-grandchildren have to deal with the court dates. Several students began quietly gathering their belongings. A mass exodus was clearly being contemplated. Professor Velneth couldn't blame them. Human lawyers were terrifying in ways that transcended language barriers. There was a reason most species had treaties specifically about human legal representation. That won't be necessary. Professor Velneth said quickly, doing the mental calculation of how much time it would take for the administration board to rule on this, versus how much of his sanity would remain if he tried to teach quantum mechanics to a lecture hall where half the students were actively fleeing from a predator. Perhaps we can reach a compromise. Kira's expression shifted to something that might have been a smile on a less terrifying species. On humans, it just looked like a threat display with extra teeth. I'm listening. Captain Fluffy-Bottom may remain for today's lecture. However, he must remain in a carrier or containment unit for future classes. He gets anxious in carriers. A transparent carrier, so he can see you. Kira considered this, absently scratching Captain Fluffy-Bottom behind his ears. The predator leaned into the touch, purring again, this time loud enough that the acoustic sensors throughout the entire lecture hall began displaying error messages. Fine, Kira said eventually. But it needs to be a big carrier, like luxury suite size, with his favorite blanket and toys, and one of those automatic feeders because sometimes lectures run long and he needs his snacks. Agreed, Professor Velneth said, mostly because he wanted this conversation to end before he lost the will to continue existing. And he gets to come to the review sessions before exams because those are really stressful for me. Miss Chen, without the carrier. Because the stress, Professor, the feedback loop. It's very scientific. Professor Velneth looked around the lecture hall. The Xyrillian student had regained consciousness and was being helped to their seat by two others, all of whom were keeping at least 3 rows between themselves and the human. The planarian had successfully escaped and was probably filing a complaint with campus security. The Krasnian triplets were taking holopics and appeared to be starting a fan club. This was his life now. This was what 214 cycles of distinguished academic service had led to. Being negotiated into submission by a human with a predator and a working knowledge of administrative law. Fine, Professor Velneth said, because he was tired and there were still 47 minutes left in the lecture period, and he hadn't even gotten to the good part about quantum entanglement yet. But if that creature causes any harm to any student, he won't, Kira said confidently. Captain Fluffybottom is a perfect gentleman, aren't you, baby? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Captain Fluffybottom responded by attempting to bite her finger, then licking the same finger, then biting it again. This was apparently what humans considered affection. Professor Velneth had read 17 academic papers trying to explain human bonding behaviors with their domesticated predators, and every single one had concluded with some variation of, "Ooh, we don't know, they're just like that." Now then, Professor Velneth said, manipulating his holographic display to return to his lecture notes. If we can all return to the topic of quantum superposition. Professor? This from a Voluvian student in the middle rows, one of the few who hadn't fled. I have a question. Yes? Is it true that humans keep multiple predators in their dwellings? For entertainment purposes? Professor Velneth looked at Kira Chen, who was smiling that terrifying human smile again. Oh yeah, she said cheerfully. I've got 3 more at home, 2 cats and a dog. The dog's bigger than me. His name is Destroyer of Worlds, but we call him Biscuit because he makes this funny face when you give him treats. The Voluvian student made a sound like someone choking on their own existential dread. Captain Fluffybottom is actually the smallest, Kira continued, clearly warming to the topic. He's just the only one who doesn't get carsick during shuttle rides. Well, he does. But he handles it better. More discreetly. Usually. Miss Chen, perhaps we should return to quantum mechanics. Right. Sorry, Professor. Captain Fluffybottom is very interested in quantum mechanics, actually. Especially the part about particles existing in multiple states simultaneously. He does that too, but with his emotional state. One moment he's cuddly, the next he's trying to kill my feet. It's very quantum. This was not, in any way, how quantum mechanics worked. But Professor Velneth was not going to argue with a human while she was holding a predator. He had read the incident reports. He knew how these things ended. As I was saying, he pressed on, determined to salvage at least some educational value from this disaster. Quantum superposition allows particles to exist in multiple states until observed, at which point the wave function collapses and... A hand raised. A Threxian student, brave soul. Yes? Does this mean Schrodinger's cat is both alive and dead until observed? Kira Chen's expression shifted. It was subtle, but Professor Velneth had learned to read human danger signs. This particular expression usually preceded what humans called getting on a soapbox about something they felt strongly about. Okay, so about Schrodinger's cat, Kira began. And Professor Velneth felt his teaching career crumbling in real time. First of all, Schrödinger proposed that thought experiment to show how ridiculous the Copenhagen interpretation was, not to support it. Everyone forgets that part. Second, and more importantly, The whole premise involves putting a cat in a box with poison, which is messed up. Captain Fluffybottom meowed, as if in agreement. Like, who does that? Who thinks you know what would make this physics problem better? Animal cruelty. It's the same energy as those philosophy problems about trolleys running over people. Why is the trolley running over people? Where's the trolley conductor? Why is this happening? The Threxian student who had asked the question looked deeply confused, which was fair because they now had 3 eye stalks pointing in different directions. The thought experiment is theoretical, Professor Velneth interjected weakly. Okay, but it's normalized putting cats in boxes, which is how you get people thinking it's okay to put cats in carriers for entire lectures, which is cruel and unusual punishment and probably violates the... Miss Chen, you literally just agreed to put Captain Fluffybottom in a carrier for future lectures. A luxury carrier. Huge difference. With toys and snacks. It's more like a mobile apartment than a carrier. Totally different vibe. Professor Velneth realized he had lost control of his lectures somewhere around the time a predator had entered the room, and decided that regaining it was probably beyond his current capability. Perhaps he could just let this play out and hope for minimal casualties. Okay, Kira continued, on a roll now. But, the real question about Schrodinger's cat isn't whether it's alive or dead. It's why everyone assumes the cat is just sitting there, passively waiting to be observed. Have you met a cat? Captain Fluffybottom would have. Knocked the poison over within 30 seconds, and then gotten out of the box somehow. Cats are liquid. They're the real quantum particles. Cats are not quantum particles, Professor Velneth said, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Aren't they, though? They can be solid or liquid depending on the container. They exist in superposition between I love you and I will murder you in your sleep at all times. They can apparently teleport because 1 second they're on the floor and the next they're on top of the refrigerator and no one saw them move. That's pretty quantum if you ask me. No one had asked her. No one would have dared. But she was going anyway, because that was what humans did. They took perfectly reasonable scientific concepts and applied them to their death animals, and everyone just had to accept it. The most quantum thing about cats, Kira said, scratching Captain Fluffybottom under the chin, is that they're simultaneously the most independent and the most needy creatures in the universe. Like, he'll ignore me for 3 hours straight. But if I go to the bathroom without him, it's a personal betrayal that requires extensive apology treats. Captain Fluffybottom, as if to demonstrate this principle, jumped from Kira's shoulder to her lap, circled 3 times, kneaded her leg with his claws in a way that made several students flinch, and then settled down to sleep. See? Quantum, unpredictable, exists in all states simultaneously. That's not... Professor Velneth started, then stopped. What was the point? Humans were going to human. They were going to take perfectly good science and apply it to their predators and call it cute, and somehow get away with it because they had lawyers and legal precedents and an inexplicable ability to make everyone around them question their life choices. Let's take a short break, Professor Velneth announced, because he needed to sit down and possibly reconsider his career trajectory. 15 minutes. Miss Chen, your Captain Fluffybottom stays with you. Obviously, Kira said. Where else would he go? Somewhere far away from me, Professor Velneth thought, but didn't say, because he was fairly certain Kira's mother, the terrifying human lawyer, could sue him for emotional distress on behalf of a predator and somehow win. The lecture hall emptied faster than it did during actual fire drills. The Krasnian triplets stayed, of course, and had moved to seats closer to Kira, presumably to get better holopics of Captain Fluffybottom. There was also, Professor Velneth noticed with some surprise, a small group of students clustered near the back who hadn't left. He approached them during the break, curious. "Are you not concerned about the predator?" he asked a Zephyrite student who was part of the group. "Oh, we're terrified," the Zephyrite said cheerfully. "But we're not going to miss this lecture. Do you know how hard it is to get into advanced quantum mechanics? There's a waiting list, 3 cycles long. If we leave, we lose our spots. You'd rather risk predation than lose your spot in class? I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds bad. But also, have you seen how much my parents are paying for tuition? If I don't graduate with honors, I'm going to have to move back to the home world and work at my uncle's moisture farm. That's worse than anything a cat could do to me." This was the other thing about having humans at the Institute, Professor Velneth reflected. Their influence spread. They made other species brave, or stupid. The line between the two was often blurry where humans were involved. The break ended. Students trickled back in, though the lecture hall was noticeably emptier than it had been at the start of class. Professor Velneth did a quick count. He'd started with 203 students. He now had approximately 87. "All right," he said, because he was nothing if not dedicated to his profession. "Let's continue with quantum entanglement. This is the phenomenon where 2 particles become correlated in such a way that the quantum state of one particle cannot be described independently of the other, even when separated by large distances." Kira's hand went up. Professor Velneth considered ignoring it. He considered pretending he hadn't seen it. He considered the sweet embrace of retirement. "Yes, Miss Chen?" "So, like how Captain Fluffybottom and I are connected emotionally across space-time?" "No. But we are, though. Like, he knows when I'm sad, even if I'm in a different room. That's entanglement." "That's," Professor Velneth said slowly, "not quantum entanglement. That's you having a predator with functioning sensory organs who has learned to recognize your emotional states to better manipulate you into providing food." "Wow, Professor. Cynical much?" Captain Fluffybottom chose this moment to wake up, stretch, and headbutt Kira's chin in what she clearly interpreted as affection, and what Professor Velneth recognized as a marking behavior to declare ownership of territory, which, in this case, was Kira's face. "It's true though, right, buddy?" Kira cooed at the predator. "You're just using me for snacks and warm lap. But that's okay because I'm using you for emotional support and as an excuse to skip social events I don't want to attend. It's symbiotic." "That's not symbiotic, that's mutual exploitation," Professor Velneth said. "Tomato, tomato." "Humans," a Vrelian student muttered from somewhere in the remaining crowd. "They're all insane." "I heard that," Kira called out cheerfully. "And yeah, probably. We did spend thousands of years domesticating wolves into designer handbag dogs and then convinced ourselves that we were the ones in charge of the relationship. That's some impressive self-delusion." Professor Velneth decided to just push through. He had 47 slides left in his presentation. He was going to get through them, even if it killed him. Which it might. Stress was a leading cause of death for his species, and his stress levels had increased by approximately 400% since the beginning of this lecture. "Quantum entanglement," he pressed on, "has been experimentally verified multiple times and remains one of the most fascinating aspects of quantum mechanics. Einstein famously called it spooky action at a distance because he was disturbed by the implications. Einstein also had messy hair and didn't wear socks. Kira contributed helpfully. So maybe we shouldn't base our entire understanding of quantum mechanics on what made him uncomfortable. Einstein was one of the greatest minds in human history, Professor Velneth said, feeling oddly defensive of a human scientist he'd never met. Sure, but he was also wrong about quantum mechanics being incomplete. The universe is under no obligation to make sense to anyone, even Einstein, or you, or me, or Captain Fluffybottom, who definitely doesn't understand quantum mechanics, but lives by quantum principles anyway, because cats are chaos entities in biological form. This lecture had gotten away from Professor Velneth somewhere around the part where a predator entered the room, and he'd accepted it. He was no longer teaching quantum mechanics, he was survival teaching. He was saying words and hoping some of them formed coherent sentences about science, while a human provided color commentary that somehow related every principle back to her emotional support predator. The point is, Professor Velneth said, with the weariness of someone who had gazed into the abyss and found the abyss had a human in it holding a cat. Quantum mechanics describes the universe at its most fundamental level in ways that often defy classical intuition. Like cats, Kira agreed. Not like cats. Pretty sure cats are quantum. We've established this. We've established nothing. You've made wild assertions based on... Captain Fluffybottom yawned again, this time adding a little chirp at the end that made approximately 12 students clutch their desks in terror. The Krasnian triplets applauded. The rest of the lecture proceeded in much the same fashion. Professor Velneth would attempt to explain a concept. Kira would find a way to relate it to cats. Captain Fluffybottom would do something that demonstrated neither quantum mechanics nor feline understanding of physics, but rather the sheer audacity of a species that had convinced humans they were domesticated. By the time the lecture ended, Professor Velneth felt like he'd aged several cycles. His eye stalks drooped. His voice translator had developed a slight stutter. His primary brain had filed a formal complaint with his secondary brain about working conditions. The students filed out in a hurry. Only Kira remained, packing up her belongings with Captain Fluffybottom now sprawled across her datapad, like he was trying to prevent her from leaving. "Thanks for the lecture, Professor," Kira said brightly, as if she hadn't just traumatized half the class. "See you next week?" "With the carrier," Professor Velneth said firmly. "With the luxury mobile cat apartment," Kira corrected. "I've already ordered it. It has windows and a chandelier." "A chandelier? A tiny one, for ambiance." Of course it did, because humans couldn't just put their predators in carriers like normal species. They had to add chandeliers. They probably also had tiny butler robots that served the cats food on silver platters while wearing tuxedos. "I'll see you next week, Miss Chen." "Cool. Oh, by the way, my roommate is thinking about enrolling in this class next semester." "Wonderful," Professor Velneth said, because more students were always welcome, and he was trying to be positive despite everything. "Yeah, she has an emotional support animal too. It's a snake, like a really big snake. But don't worry, it's super chill. Mostly eats rats, sometimes rabbits. It's very well behaved." Professor Velneth stood very still as this information processed through his multiple brains. "A snake," he said finally. "Yep, named Noodle, because she's long and wiggly. Get it?" "I get it." "Cool. See you next week, Professor." Kira Chen left. Captain Fluffybottom draped over her shoulder like a furry stole, both of them completely unbothered by the chaos they'd caused. Professor Velneth stood alone in the empty lecture hall. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear campus security getting called to the building 3 over, because apparently someone's emotional support tarantula had escaped and was causing a building-wide evacuation. He pulled out his personal communication device and began composing a message to the administration board. Subject line: urgent discussion required regarding emotional support, animal policies, and my continued employment. Perhaps the satellite campus on Rigel 7 was hiring. He heard they had a strict no predators policy. That sounded nice. Quiet, safe, boring in all the best ways. His device pinged. An email from the administration board. Dear Professor Velneth, we understand you had an incident in your class today regarding a student's emotional support animal. Please be advised that, as per the Galactic Institute's commitment to inclusive education and following the precedent established in Cathrax versus the Administration Board, emotional support animals of all types are permitted in classroom settings provided they meet health and safety requirements. We appreciate your flexibility and understanding in this matter. Welcome to the future of education. Professor Velneth deleted his draft email. He looked at his lecture notes for next week. Quantum tunneling. The phenomenon where particles pass through barriers that classical physics says should be impenetrable. He thought about Captain Fluffybottom, who would probably find a way to quantum tunnel out of his luxury carrier within the first 15 minutes of class. He thought about the snake named Noodle, who might be joining them next semester. He thought about the fact that he had dedicated 2 centuries to education, and this is where it had led him. And then Professor Velneth did what any reasonable professor would do when faced with the reality of teaching in an era where humans brought predators to class and called it emotional support. He opened his drawer, pulled out a bottle of Xantharian brandy that he'd been saving for his retirement party, and took a long drink. It was going to be a long semester. Outside, in the hallway, he could hear Kira Chen talking to another student. Yeah, Captain Fluffybottom really likes quantum mechanics. I'm thinking about enrolling him in the advanced physics seminar next semester. Do you think they allow cats to get degrees? Because he'd probably do better than half the students. Professor Velneth took another drink. Tomorrow, he decided, he would look into that position on Rigel 7. Or maybe he'd just lean into it. Start a new course. Quantum Mechanics and Feline Dynamics. Required text: why does my cat do that? A quantum perspective. The humans would love it. Everyone else would be terrified. But at least he'd be prepared. Captain Fluffybottom's purring echoed down the hallway, a rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the Institute itself. A constant reminder that humans had arrived. They'd brought their predators, and no amount of university regulations was going to stop them. Welcome to the future of education, indeed.